Human behavior often runs on patterns we barely notice. We may believe we are making every decision deliberately, yet many of our reactions are driven by deeply conditioned emotional survival responses. Few relationship dynamics reveal this more clearly than the cycle between an avoidant person and a deeply empathetic partner. One person retreats, the other reaches harder. One creates distance, the other desperately tries to restore closeness. Over time, this can make the avoidant appear to hold all the power. They withdraw, expecting anxiety, repeated messages, emotional questions, and desperate attempts to reconnect. They become comfortable because they believe they already know what you will do next. But what happens when that predictable pattern suddenly disappears? What happens when the person on the other side of the wall stops chasing, stops pleading, and stops allowing someone else's withdrawal to control their emotional state? That is where the entire dynamic begins to change. There is a particular kind of empath who responds very differently to emotional distance. They can still feel deeply, understand subtle emotions, and recognize the pain underneath someone's behavior. But they do not allow empathy to turn into emotional dependence. They don't collapse when someone pulls away. They don't desperately pursue answers or try to force intimacy. Instead, they remain grounded enough to observe what is happening without becoming consumed by it. When an avoidant encounters this kind of person, their usual strategy becomes far less effective. The emotional reaction they expected simply isn't there. The person they thought would chase remains calm. The person they assumed would panic stays centered. If you've ever experienced the painful confusion of loving someone who suddenly becomes distant, cold, or unavailable, this distinction matters. Rather than trying to force someone to open up, the real shift begins when you stop allowing their behavior to determine your emotional stability. At first glance, an avoidant person can appear incredibly powerful. They may seem detached, independent, emotionally untouchable, and completely comfortable walking away from intimacy. But distance can create an illusion of strength. When they suddenly become cold or unavailable, they may unconsciously expect you to react with anxiety. They expect questions, emotional conversations, repeated attempts to reconnect, or visible distress. Now imagine that the expected reaction never arrives. They take a step backward, waiting for you to follow. But instead, you remain exactly where you are. You don't become hostile. You don't create drama. You don't try to punish them. You simply stay emotionally regulated. Your voice remains calm. Your behavior remains consistent. You can acknowledge what is happening without becoming consumed by it. That moment can disrupt the entire pattern because the usual cause and effect relationship has disappeared. Their withdrawal no longer automatically produces your pursuit. Many people assume that overcoming emotional distance requires giving more love, showing endless patience, or becoming even more emotionally available. But more intensity does not necessarily create more security. Sometimes it reinforces the very cycle that keeps two people trapped. A grounded empath approaches the situation differently. They recognize that understanding another person's emotions does not require abandoning their own boundaries. They can notice the small changes in behavior, the reduced eye contact, shorter answers, physical distance, sudden disengagement, without immediately turning those observations into a personal crisis. Instead of reacting automatically, they pause and decide how they want to respond. That ability to regulate yourself is powerful because it prevents another person's withdrawal from becoming the center of your emotional world. You don't need to defeat their defenses. You simply stop feeding the cycle that keeps those defenses in place. Once you understand the pattern, their distance becomes information rather than a command, telling you how to feel. To understand why this approach can change the dynamic, we need to look beyond romantic labels and examine what may be happening emotionally. Avoidant behavior is often less about genuine emotional strength and more about managing discomfort through distance. For someone who feels overwhelmed by closeness, vulnerability can trigger an intense need for control and personal space. When an emotionally expressive partner enters their world, that openness can feel overwhelming rather than comforting. The empath may communicate feelings directly, seek reassurance, and want deeper connection, while the avoidant interprets that intensity as pressure. Their nervous system becomes activated, and withdrawal becomes their quickest method of regaining a sense of control. Then the partner notices the distance and becomes anxious. They pursue. The avoidant retreats further. The pursuit then confirms their belief that closeness threatens their independence. The cycle continues, not necessarily because either person intends to hurt the other, but because both are reacting from deeply established emotional patterns. A more grounded empath operates from a different internal position. They can recognize emotional undercurrents without becoming responsible for fixing every feeling they encounter. They understand that someone else's discomfort is not automatically theirs to solve. When an avoidant begins pulling away, they notice the shift without immediately chasing an explanation. They may recognize the signs that the person is becoming emotionally deactivated, but instead of reacting impulsively, they allow themselves time to respond thoughtfully. This doesn't mean becoming cold or pretending not to care. It means separating compassion from self-abandonment. You can understand why someone needs distance without sacrificing your own peace to accommodate it. You can care about someone while still allowing them to manage their own emotions. That combination of empathy and emotional discipline creates a completely different relationship dynamic, because the avoidant can no longer rely on your anxiety to determine the emotional temperature of the relationship. When someone repeatedly withdraws, one of the most powerful responses is often to stop pursuing them, not as a manipulation tactic, not as a punishment, and not as a calculated attempt to make them afraid of losing you. Simply stop forcing a connection that the other person is temporarily refusing to participate in. If they ask for space, give them appropriate space without turning it into a dramatic emotional event. You don't need to demand an immediate explanation or make their withdrawal a referendum on your worth. This can feel uncomfortable at first because your instinct may be to repair the connection immediately. But constantly pursuing someone who is retreating can create an exhausting cycle for both people. When you step back with genuine self-respect, you remove the pressure from the interaction. You also create room to see whether the other person eventually chooses connection on their own. That distinction matters because healthy closeness cannot be built through emotional chasing. When the avoidant eventually reaches out, the grounded empath does not necessarily respond with punishment or resentment. They also don't pretend that nothing happened if the pattern has been harmful. Instead, they can respond with calmness and clarity. Something as simple as acknowledging that the other person needed time while remaining open to respectful communication can change the emotional atmosphere. There is no need to make their return a victory or their absence a catastrophe. The goal isn't to make them feel guilty for needing space. The goal is to establish a healthier standard for how connection works. You can respect someone's need for distance while also making it clear that disappearing repeatedly is not a sustainable form of intimacy. When you stop turning every interaction into an emotional battle, the relationship becomes easier to evaluate honestly. You can finally ask a more important question. Is this person capable of meeting me with consistency, communication, and mutual effort? The deeper transformation happens when your emotional state is no longer controlled by another person's availability. An avoidant may be accustomed to sensing anxiety urgency, or emotional pressure when they create distance. When those reactions disappear, the interaction becomes less predictable. They may reach out casually, send a small message, or test whether the emotional connection is still available. At that point, the grounded empath doesn't need to perform indifference or play psychological games. They simply remain steady. They respond according to their actual values, rather than according to fear. If they want to communicate, they communicate. If something needs to be addressed, they address it. If the relationship continues to repeat a painful cycle, they recognize that reality, instead of trying to manipulate it into something different. This is where personal power really comes from. Not from controlling another person's emotions, but from refusing to surrender control of your own. This is why emotional strength should never be confused with emotional coldness. You don't become powerful by hurting someone who hurt you. You become stronger by reaching a point where their silence, inconsistency, or withdrawal no longer determines your sense of worth. You stop seeing their attention as a prize you must earn. You stop treating every moment of distance as an emergency. And you stop believing that you have to climb every wall someone builds. If a person wants a meaningful place in your life, they eventually have to participate in the relationship rather than appearing only when it feels comfortable for them. They have to communicate, take responsibility, and tolerate the vulnerability that comes with genuine closeness. Your role is not to tear down their defenses for them. Your role is to decide whether the person behind those defenses is willing to meet you honestly. Sometimes, the most powerful change begins when you simply stop chasing the door that someone keeps choosing to close. To fully understand this dynamic, we also need to challenge the image of the avoidant as an emotionally invincible fortress. From the outside, someone who can suddenly become distant may look completely unaffected. They may stop answering, reduce affection, disappear into their own world, or act as though connection is unnecessary. For the person left behind, this can create the painful impression that the avoidant cares less and therefore holds all the power. But emotional distance does not automatically equal emotional strength. Someone can appear extremely independent while privately struggling with vulnerability, emotional regulation, or discomfort with intimacy. A person who genuinely feels secure does not need to repeatedly escape every difficult emotional moment simply to regain equilibrium. Their ability to communicate through discomfort is what demonstrates strength. Withdrawal may instead be a coping strategy that temporarily reduces emotional pressure. Once you understand that distinction, their coldness stops looking like proof that you are powerless. The walls an avoidant builds are often less about declaring that you are unworthy and more about protecting themselves from feelings they don't know how to process. Emotional closeness can activate fears surrounding dependence, rejection, loss of autonomy, or being overwhelmed by another person's needs. So they create distance because distance feels manageable. Unfortunately, that behavior can be deeply painful for the person on the receiving end. The important realization is that you don't have to interpret every withdrawal as a verdict on your value. Their reaction may tell you far more about their capacity for intimacy than it does about your desirability or worth. Once you stop personalizing every retreat, you gain clarity. You can observe the pattern without becoming trapped inside it. And when you stop responding to every withdrawal with panic, you also stop reinforcing the cycle. You are no longer trying to prove that you deserve access to someone who repeatedly chooses to close the door. The old pattern depends heavily on predictability. They pull away, you become distressed. They disappear, you reach out. They become cold, you work harder to restore warmth. Eventually, both people know the choreography so well that neither has to consciously choose it. But a cycle cannot continue in exactly the same way when one person changes their response. That doesn't mean you are manipulating the other person or trying to make them anxious. It means you are reclaiming responsibility for your own behavior. Instead of asking, "What can I do to make them come closer?" you begin asking, "What kind of relationship am I willing to participate in?" That is a completely different question. It moves your attention away from controlling someone else's attachment responses and toward evaluating compatibility, boundaries, communication, and mutual effort. Once that shift happens, you stop being trapped by someone else's emotional rhythm. You become capable of choosing whether the relationship deserves your continued energy at all. The moment you stop viewing the avoidance emotional fortress as evidence of strength and begin recognizing it as a fragile, protective response, your entire perspective changes. You no longer see someone who has complete mastery over emotions. You see a person relying on a deeply conditioned pattern to manage feelings they may not know how to handle. That realization can remove much of the fear surrounding their withdrawal. Their silence no longer automatically means you have lost power or that you are somehow unworthy of connection. It becomes a behavior that can be observed rather than a command you must obey emotionally. This is also where many empathetic people make a mistake. They assume that because they understand another person's pain, the answer must be to give more love, more reassurance, and more emotional openness. Yet with someone who becomes overwhelmed by intimacy, increasing emotional intensity can sometimes create even greater distance. The deeply emotional empath usually responds to disconnection by moving closer. When they sense that someone they love is hurting, withdrawing, or becoming emotionally unavailable, their instinct is often to increase their effort. They explain themselves more carefully, express their feelings more intensely, send longer messages, offer additional reassurance, and try harder to prove that the relationship is safe. Their intentions are usually sincere. They genuinely believe that if they can communicate enough love, the other person will finally understand how deeply they care and feel safe enough to open up. But the problem is that emotional intensity can be interpreted very differently by someone who becomes uncomfortable with closeness. What feels like reassurance to the empath can feel like pressure to the avoidant. What feels like an invitation to connect can feel like another demand they are expected to fulfill. So the very behavior intended to create safety may accidentally increase the desire for distance. Imagine someone already feeling overwhelmed by emotional closeness, suddenly receiving a flood of messages, questions, explanations, tears, and requests for reassurance. Even when those actions come from love, they can create the sensation of being emotionally cornered. The avoidant may begin to associate intimacy with responsibility, pressure, or a perceived loss of independence. Then, the more distressed the empath becomes, the more the avoidant wants to escape. The empath sees that retreat and becomes even more anxious, which leads to more pursuit. Soon, both people are reinforcing the exact pattern neither of them wants. The avoidant thinks, "This is why I need distance," while the empath thinks, "I need to try harder before I lose them." Neither realizes that their reactions are feeding each other. The relationship becomes a loop in which one person retreats to feel safe and the other pursues to feel secure. Each response unintentionally strengthens the other person's fear. There is another problem hidden inside this cycle. When the empath's emotional stability becomes completely dependent on whether the avoidant responds warmly, the balance of the relationship becomes unhealthy. Every message, every delay, every change in tone starts carrying enormous emotional weight. The empath begins looking for signs of reassurance, while the avoidant starts feeling responsible for emotions they may not feel capable of managing. This can create even more pressure. The avoidant may think that if they come closer, they will somehow become responsible for keeping the other person emotionally stable. That possibility can make intimacy feel even more threatening. Meanwhile, the empath may gradually sacrifice their own boundaries just to maintain the connection. They give more, tolerate more, explain more, and ask for less, hoping that eventually their efforts will be rewarded with consistency. But love should never require you to continually abandon your emotional stability just to keep someone from leaving. Breaking this cycle requires a significant change in perspective. Empathy is valuable, but empathy without boundaries can become self-neglect. Understanding someone's emotional wounds does not mean you must absorb them, repair them, or organize your life around them. Good intentions alone cannot guarantee a healthy outcome if your behavior continually reinforces an unhealthy pattern. If someone withdraws every time intimacy increases, repeatedly pursuing them may not solve the problem. It may simply teach both people that withdrawal will always be followed by pursuit. A healthier response is to become more intentional about how you participate. You can care deeply without chasing. You can remain compassionate without abandoning yourself. You can understand someone's need for space without making their distance the center of your existence. The goal is not to become emotionally unavailable yourself. The goal is to develop enough emotional regulation that another person's withdrawal does not automatically dictate your next move. This is where the grounded empath becomes different. They still possess strong emotional awareness. They can notice subtle changes in facial expressions, shifts in someone's voice, changes in body language, and the emotional atmosphere surrounding a conversation. They may understand that someone is becoming uncomfortable long before that person admits it, but instead of immediately absorbing those emotions, they observe them. They create a psychological separation between understanding what another person feels and becoming controlled by what that person feels. That distinction is incredibly important. When the avoidant becomes distant, the grounded empath doesn't automatically interpret the distance as personal rejection. They don't immediately assume they have done something wrong. They don't rush to repair an emotional situation that the other person has chosen to step away from. They recognize the behavior, remain aware of their own feelings, and decide how they want to respond from a position of stability rather than fear. When the avoidant becomes cold, communication may suddenly become shorter. Messages can become brief. Eye contact may decrease. Physical closeness may disappear. The atmosphere may change almost instantly. A highly anxious empath may experience all of these signals as an emergency requiring immediate action. A grounded empath sees them differently. They treat them as information. They might think, something has shifted, rather than immediately thinking, I am being rejected. That small difference can completely change their behavior. They don't need to interrogate the situation or force a conversation before the other person is ready. They can remain present without becoming intrusive. They can give space without becoming resentful. And most importantly, they can continue living their own life instead of putting everything on hold while waiting for the avoidant to return. Their empathy remains intact, but it is guided by self-respect rather than fear. Once the empath stops providing constant emotional reactions, the entire relationship can feel unfamiliar to the avoidant. They may have become accustomed to withdrawal producing an immediate response. They disappear, and the other person reaches out. They become cold, and the other person tries harder. They create uncertainty, and the other person seeks reassurance. When that pattern suddenly stops, there is nothing to push against. The silence simply remains. The avoidant may then begin wondering whether the relationship has actually changed. They might send a casual message, ask an ordinary question, share something small, or find another low-pressure reason to reconnect. These moments should not automatically be interpreted as manipulation. Sometimes they are simply tentative attempts at reconnecting. The important thing is that the grounded empath doesn't overreact. They respond according to the quality of the interaction, rather than according to the fear of losing the person. This is where the emotional balance begins to shift. Not because the empath has learned how to control the avoidant, but because they have stopped allowing the avoidant to control them. The person who once seemed impossible to lose suddenly becomes someone you can evaluate realistically. You can ask whether their actions match their words. You can observe whether they communicate consistently. You can determine whether they are capable of emotional accountability. Their attention no longer feels like a rare reward that you must earn through endless patience. You stop placing their affection on a pedestal simply because it is difficult to obtain. At the same time, you don't need to convince yourself that you don't care. You can care and still have standards. You can love someone and still recognize that love alone cannot create a secure relationship. That is the real foundation of emotional strength. Not becoming indifferent, but becoming stable enough to make decisions from clarity. The avoidant may be used to controlling the rhythm of closeness. They decide when they are available, when they need distance, and when they feel comfortable returning. But once the empath stops organizing their emotional world around those changes, that rhythm loses its power. The avoidant is no longer controlling the temperature of the entire relationship simply by becoming distant. This can create an unfamiliar experience for them. They may begin realizing that their withdrawal does not guarantee that the other person will remain emotionally frozen in place, waiting for their return. That realization can bring up difficult feelings. They may begin wondering whether they have pushed away someone who genuinely cared. They may question whether their usual defenses have protected them or simply created loneliness. Those questions can be uncomfortable, but they are also important because genuine intimacy requires people to eventually confront the patterns that keep them isolated. If the avoidant begins testing the connection again, the grounded empath doesn't need to punish them or make them prove their worth through emotional suffering. They can simply remain consistent. A casual message receives a calm response. A sincere attempt at conversation receives openness. Disrespect receives a boundary. Disappearance does not receive frantic pursuit. This consistency creates clarity. The other person begins to understand that access to the empath is not controlled by emotional games. Connection is available when there is mutual effort, honesty, and respect. It is not something that disappears as punishment, nor is it something that remains endlessly available, regardless of how the empath is treated. That balance can be far healthier than the old cycle. It communicates something powerful without requiring manipulation. I care about you, but I will not abandon myself to keep you close. Eventually, the avoidant faces a choice that no psychological trick can make for them. They can continue hiding behind emotional distance, maintaining the same protective patterns and accepting the loneliness those patterns create. Or they can begin taking the uncomfortable steps toward genuine vulnerability. That means communicating instead of disappearing. It means acknowledging feelings instead of suppressing them. It means allowing another person to matter without automatically interpreting closeness as a threat to independence. And it means understanding that a relationship cannot survive indefinitely on one person's pursuit and the other's retreat. The grounded empath does not force that transformation. They simply stop carrying the entire relationship alone. They make space for the other person to step forward voluntarily. If the avoidant chooses to do that, genuine connection becomes possible. If they don't, the empath still retains something far more valuable than control over another person. Control over their own dignity, boundaries, peace, and emotional direction.